last week we talked about geography, and I think it became quite clear that geography plays obviously a very large part, right, of human sort of experiences through history, especially in the pre-modern era. One of the major things that we need to consider is the role of geography in shaping or challenging human existence. And so then therefore, how did humans react and interact with the natural environment, thereby creating, right, a series of developments as we understand it in the pre-modern era. So for today, as we think about geography, we're moving away from the physical environment and actually thinking about the human experience here, okay? And for East Asia, prehistory is an interesting period of study for a couple of reasons. While the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, and we will talk about that in the second half of today's 1 hour class, when we get there in about 30 minutes or so. While the Neolithic period is quite well incorporated into what I call the historical narrative, right? So for China, for example, they have a way of thinking about their history, extending all the way back by, multiple dynasties, beginning with these 5 august rulers and so on and so forth. But then they've been able to sort of try to incorporate Neolithic history, material culture, and whatever they know of the Neolithic period of China's history, for example, into their historiography so that it's a continuous line. Same thing with Japan. To some extent, Korea has managed to kind of try to do that too. The earlier sort of prehistory, which is the Paleolithic, and even the really early Stone Age, right? Looking at hominid, for example, hominid men, around about 400,000 BC, poses some challenges to countries in East Asia in terms of their national narrative, partly because it's quite remote in the past, and then it's quite difficult for them to sort of think about how that could be integrated into a continuous historical narrative, right, for their country. And so sometimes it may look kind of like scientific and disjointed, and the Paleolithic period or the Old Stone Age of East Asian history tends to be somewhat remote. Okay, now we're going to try to see if we can make some sense of it, at least in today's class. So we'll focus on China just to sort of encapsulate some of the ideas that we may be thinking about. So where do we start, right? And I think it begins quite early on, roughly about 400,000 years before the present. And let me just see if the pen's working. Okay, great. And so, of course, thinking about human migration across the globe, this is a map that sort of illustrates that in fairly simplistic terms. And for East Asia, there are 2 migratory patterns that we do need to think about. The first one is marked by this yellow line here, okay, which is the migratory pattern of hominid men or Homo erectus, not quite the same, at least in terms of species type, as Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are, okay? So very early on, roughly about before 400,000 BC, okay? Scientists who are looking at the scientific data in terms of migratory patterns over a long period of time, have suggested that humans migrated obviously out of Africa, crossing Central Asia, across South Asia, and then eventually arriving in the northern plains of China around about 700,000 years ago. All right, that same group has more recently been shown to have also migrated across the Sea of Japan into the lands or the islands that today form both the Korean Peninsula as well as the Japanese archipelago. Okay, so that's this very early wave of migration that occurs like a really long time ago. And then we look at the map of Paleolithic man or Homo erectus or hominid man, depending on what term you want to use, but I'm using them relatively interchangeably, meaning that they're not the humans that we understand as we are today, right? Homo sapiens. Okay, these are a more primitive, as it were, if you think of like biological evolution, a slightly less developed type or species of humans that are much shorter, have smaller cranial capacities. The brain sizes are a lot smaller, and you will notice that they are clustered around several geographical regions. So, can anybody just very quickly tell me where these clusters are based on the numbers that we are seeing here and the points that the numbers are located on the map? Anyone? Shall I call out the name? All right, let me see. All right, Crystal. All right, Hunter, why don't you go ahead first then?
They're gathered around bodies of water.
So bodies of water such as this part here, for example, yeah, which is the confluence of the Yellow River, and then possibly another one over here at the delta region of the Yangtze River. Where else? Anyone else? Any ideas? Let me ask a question then. Why do you think there might be some clusters over on this side? Or even over here? Number 1, 2, and 3. Anybody?
Is it mountainous?
Yeah. So we are actually looking at mountains or highland areas that actually not just are mountains, but actually have caves. And in this part of Northeast China in particular, huge, sort of large numbers of limestone caves that are located there, right? So on the one hand, bodies of water are absolutely important. And then on the other hand, you also have basically places that have caves. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Part of the reason why water and caves are necessary, obviously, is so that you can survive. Without water, you will not have crops, you can't find animals, and so you don't have the food, right? So the hunter-gatherer pattern of existence of hominid men in places like China, for example, about 400 to 200,000 years ago, is heavily dependent on the natural environment that provides those sorts of resources for animals and plants to survive, right? But there's also a second issue, and that is the annual sort of, seasonal cyclical pattern, where there are warm months and there are cold months. And so as the cold months begin to come or approach in any given time of a year, the need, therefore, for shelter becomes very important. And that's also part of the reason why these very early Paleolithic settlement sites may be found in caves. This is actually a very common characteristic of Paleolithic society. You find that in Southeast Asia, in Europe, you see the same thing as well. And so these are fairly common characteristics of Paleolithic men in terms of how you may find them and their settlement patterns or their seasonal sort of settlement patterns. So up in the north, which is where we're looking at here, and if I move the map back, we're really looking at this location here where 1, 2, and 3 the sites number 1, 2, and 3 are located. And as you can tell, this is north of modern day Beijing, where there is a series of stone outcrops, hills. Really, they're not that high, but because of the calciferous nature of the stones, you see these very, very, very large caves, all right, located in this particular location. And archaeologists since the 1920s have been discovering Paleolithic man remains, both in terms of bones, physical remains like bones, for example, but other things as well, including sort of evidence of food, jewelry, or ornamentation, and so on and so forth, occupying what is effectively a very, very deep stratigraphic site, almost about 20 meters deep. And this entire site is approximately about 2,000 years of habitation. So fairly significant amount of time where year after year, right, groups of Paleolithic people in this part of China have been occupying this space, especially in the cold wintry months, over a very, very significant period of time. And of course, with that, you find all, the bits of food remains, ornamentation, even bones as well, and the list goes on. Some of the tools that have been discovered are some of these stone chip tools, for example, flint tools, tools that were recovered from that particular cave site. I don't know about you, but to the untrained eye, you can actually just miss this and think that we are looking at another stone right in the cave. Okay, and so they are extremely rudimentary, but I think the key are these edges here, which demonstrate that it's an intentional chipping so that you actually get a sharp cutting edge. Flint obviously is a stone that is easily chipped, but also creates very thin and sharp edges. Same thing with quartz. Sandstone a little less so, tends to get dull very easily. So this would have been used for what we call rough cutting, hammering, bashing. These would have been more precise for what we would have used for cutting, for example. And so different kinds of tools that were created to assist in how you would live life, right? Along with that would be ornamentation, where in some ways it's interesting to see that they were able to find or create tools that could create holes like that, right? On something like a shell, and these shells would have been would have had to be collected from quite far away. The nearest coastline was around about 200 to 300 miles away. So these would have been fairly rare items. These mollusk shells, but for some reason they found it aesthetically pleasing, and that it would be worth the while spending time drilling these holes and then stringing all of these pieces together, right, into a single item or ornament, right? So does anybody have any sense of what are the implications if you actually had ornamentation? What does that mean about this, like these people or these species of, living beings, for example? Anyone, when we see ornamentation?
Does it mean they have free time?
You have what, sorry?
They have a lot of free time?
Yeah, so there is the possibility that we might be looking at the fact that they had excess time on their hands. Yep, that's a possibility. Anyone else?
Could it be a symbolism of status?
Mm-hmm. There is a possibility of status differentiation, right, that comes through things like that. So not everybody would have been able to have one of these sorts of sets of shell ornaments because they are relatively rare. And so whoever has it may be a sign of demonstrating that they are different, right, from other people, and obviously possibly of higher status. So that's a good one. What else? Anyone else?
Organized society.
Mm-hmm. Sorry?
Organized society.
Okay, what do you mean by that, organized society?
So like they are like forming kind of like groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the possibility that you might be looking at the fact that there is some kind of differentiation in activities, for example, and also in what we understand as societies where there is social stratification, right? These might be evidence of of those sorts of things developing within a particular group. Maybe one more. Anybody? One more.
I was thinking probably something that they use for trade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it's come from somewhere far away, there's a likelihood that it wasn't necessarily one or a bunch of them from this group, right? That walked that 200-300 miles to the beach to collect these shells and came back. There is the possibility that there may be other groups that were along that route, and so they would collect those close to the sea, and then they would have exchanged it between groups. And over time, you would find these things showing up much further away from where the actual geographical source of origin might have been, right? So there is then the possibility of trade that is being manifested here. Yeah, so these are all really good ideas, good points, very good possibilities. Of course, it's hard to be sure because we don't have a full set of data across space and time, right, to sort of demonstrate that more definitively. But definitely these are ideas about what would be evident, at least in terms of Paleolithic man very early on in somewhere, for example, like North China. Now, what is difficult, as I mentioned at the start of today's class, is this big destroy. So 400,000 to 200,000 BC, we are seeing these sorts of things. And then obviously that becomes a reinforcing development of how human societies organized themselves, saw themselves, behaved, and also interacted with other groups that were nearby. And over time, by the time you got to about 6,000 BC, as we enter into the New Stone Age, these things became increasingly reinforced. And we begin to see some very interesting and recognizable characteristics that I think we as like humans, Homo sapiens, would be able, I think, to associate with. Now, there is a gap of roughly about 200,000 years between evidence from this, for example, in North China, which dates to, at the latest, about 200,000 BC to 6,000 BC, all right? And somewhere in between that time, we get a second influx of humans that came across the migratory routes from Africa through Europe into East Asia. And so we're looking at a second group, and this time we're looking at this red migratory line here, okay? A slightly different kind of human species with much larger cranial capacities coming across from Europe into Central Asia and then eventually into Northeast Asia. That migration does not stop. Obviously, some of those people crossed the Sea of Japan and arrived in places like the Korean Peninsula as well as the Japanese archipelago, all right? And over time, displaced the Homo erectus or hominid men and became the dominant and then the sole human species in this part of East Asia by the time we get to about 6,000 BC, okay? Now, if it sounds like, you know, there are very little, there are few tenuous lines that are connecting the two sort of broad periods of history, you are not wrong, okay? There is a major gap in knowledge, and hopefully at some point in time that would be filled, but at the moment that is the state of the knowledge that we have of these sorts of developments in the prehistoric period, okay? Questions, anybody at this juncture? No? Okay. Damien, is that like a new raised hand, or is that a like an old one that you've not canceled it out? All right. Okay. So by about 6,000 BC, this is what we are looking at, at least in terms of China. Okay. You have these Neolithic cultures that, thank you, that have began to manifest themselves around about 6,000 BC, right? One being in this area here, another one up here, a third one, a fourth and fifth. And what you will notice on this map is that there is a substantial overlap between the geographical distribution of Paleolithic men from about 400,000 to 200,000 BC and Neolithic cultures in China from about 6,000 BC onwards. In other words, these are reinforcing multiple, right, successive generations of people who've lived in this area. New people have come in, they've lived as neighbors, the new people begin to dominate and eventually take over and become the sole human species that are in this area, but they are primarily located in the same geographical area, right? And the reason for that is a pretty simple one. One, the resources remain the same in these geographical spaces. So the water. And so along with that, the plants and the food, the fauna, and so on and so forth have remained the same. Number two, and this will surprise many of you, the natural resources for shelter remain the same as well. And so where there were caves for Paleolithic men to live in the cold months, same thing too for Neolithic men as well by about 6000 BC, relying primarily on the same geographical setting so that they could tide over and live through the cold months, including cave shelters and so on and so forth. Okay, and so you see that the map in terms of the geographical location is pretty much the same between Paleolithic and Neolithic, but there are some major distinct differences, right? The developments that occurred by about 6000 BC set Neolithic cultures apart from the Paleolithic cultures. And what are these? So there are a whole bunch of them, but today we will really only be looking at four, settlement patterns being one, religious or spiritual outlook being another one, the third one being social stratification. These are all things that you've mentioned just now, about maybe 5-10 minutes ago. And the fourth one, which nobody mentioned earlier, but it's actually quite important and was evident by the time you had the shell ornaments, and that was the whole idea or concept of aesthetics, right? That which is beautiful, what do you view as being beautiful, and how do you produce and reproduce that? So these are the four kind of distinct characteristics that we'll be looking at of Neolithic society from about 6000 BC onwards. So to begin with, the architecture becomes a lot more permanent. So for Paleolithic men, you can only find them in caves, mainly because the impetus or the ability to build more permanent structures was not there, right around about 400,000 to 200,000 BC. But by about 6000 BC, this is what we are seeing. Foundation bases that are dug into the ground so that you will have some kind of thermal temperature stability. In the cold months, it would be relatively warm. In the summer months, it will be relatively cool, but you would invest your time into digging these sorts of holes in the ground that are large enough over which you would put posts, and then you would clad it with, material that you could find, and it could be animal skins. More likely it would be plant fabric or plant fiber, so that you have a shelter, and that becomes basically a building, right? So these buildings are quite permanent in the sense that you can repair them. You might be there for several generations, and I don't know if anybody notices this. Does anybody know what that is? Anyone?
It's a hearse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's actually where you would probably have your fire, right? Yeah. And so what's interesting is the things that actually have prominence, right, within a so-called basic family social unit. The fire being one, the shelter being another one, and obviously a space like that would likely be able to take maybe about 5, 6, 7, 8 people. And so you can actually have a guess, at least in terms of the size of the basic social unit that we are looking at here, apart from the individual, obviously, the next level up, right, family unit. Chances are they were roughly about anywhere from 5 to 8 people, maybe even a little larger, and that was the size of the unit. Of course, that's not the only shelter that you have, and what you have are settlement patterns of this nature. So this Yangshao culture village that dates to about 5000 BC, this is what it kind of looks like. Now, can anybody tell me what are some of the distinctive features of a typical Neolithic village? And bear in mind, this is entirely man-made, right? So what are some of the features that we can pick up from this map? Anyone?
You need a cemetery because they're starting to not understand, but they're starting.
Right. So you have people who might be interred in a space, right? What else? Anything else? What else? What else you can pick up? Damien, go ahead, please.
They have roads.
They have what? Sorry? Sorry, Jessica, what did you say?
They have roads.
They have roads, and obviously it's not the kind of road that we understand today. But what it does mean is obviously that there's a deliberate path, right? That's been constructed over time. All right. What else? What else? Anyone? Just jump in. Just jump in.
The horses in the stables, which implies that they
Yeah.
have animal husbandry.
Yeah. So we have what looks like stables where you would have animals, and so therefore it hints to or it indicates animal husbandry, and not random at a fairly consistent and predictable scale. Yeah. What else? Anything else? Anyone?
Clusters of buildings.
Sorry?
Clusters of homes.
So you actually have clusters of homes, for example, in here, right? And it's interesting that some of these buildings, for example, you have another cluster here. They're not necessarily the same size, okay? Which suggests obviously different either social status or economic wealth, right? That you could have or resources to build homes, okay? So they are different sizes, but they also clustered together. So this is one group here, for example. This would be another one. There's a possibility that there's a third one here, and then maybe another one here, so on. This one looks like it's an outlier. Wonder what that is. Could be related to this or not, right? Okay. What else?
Was there a specific reason why the placements of the homes were near the cemeteries and kind of by, it doesn't seem to be any type of strategic placement of the houses, but there might be. I just don't know. What could that be?
Yeah. So why do you think that clusters of homes would be located relatively close to where you would intern dead bodies? Anybody?
When you put, because then that way, if someone dies in the house, it's fairly simple to take them over somewhere where it's appropriate to bury them, but also you're able to go and visit the people who have died.
Right. So the assumption that there might still be continuous ties between those who might be deceased and those who might still be alive, right? So that's a good possibility. What else?
Was there a place designated for food cultivation?
Sorry, Kayla, why don't you go ahead first?
Oh, sorry. Was there a place designated for food cultivation?
Yeah, and it's likely to be beyond the confines of this map. So this map really is just looking at the settlement itself, not necessarily the agricultural landscape. Okay. Jacob, did you have something that you wanted to say just now? Sorry.
Yeah. With the existence of the Lynn River on the bottom left, not only does it give the village a fresh source of water, but other animals are willing to head over there, which makes it easy.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. And it'll be interesting to see. This map doesn't quite show it, but it'll be interesting to see which direction the river flows, whether it goes this way or it goes this way, partly because then we can think of waste disposal as well. So it's not necessarily just for animals and so on and so forth. One of the big issues that any settlement pattern of this nature that is fairly permanent that you would need to do, right, is where does the poop go, right? So it'll be interesting to see where, which direction the river goes as well. What else? Maybe just one more. Someone, anyone?
For like the cemetery, could it also be like a spiritual reason to have the cemetery super close to the settlements? Since I know like Chinese culture is very like close with the deceased, and they don't really think of it as dead.
Right. So there may be a possibility of some kind of coexistence or relationship between those who are not in the natural world and those in the natural world, right? So just hang on to that, because we will actually get to the religion in a while, but that's actually a very, very important and intriguing idea that we need to think about, or at least sort of bear in mind as we think about the various aspects of Neolithic culture. And we'll talk about religion in a while. Just one last feature that nobody's really sort of mentioned, and that's this. These are, and of course, I don't expect you to know it because it's not marked in the map, but these are walls, right, that were Let me see if I have another one. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So a cluster of villages that have walls around them. And these walls are earth ramparts, which means people have to be organized, right? To build these things, you have to move earth, and you have to ram it down hard with, you know, wooden sort of poles, so that you can tempt them and they become flattened. And then you do it many layers, and then over time what you get is basically a profile like that, right? It's like a wall, right? An earthen wall. Okay. And this obviously suggests a couple of things. One, it could just be territoriality, in meaning like this is my village, and then this is your village, okay? And this is mine, right? So you have what we call group identity, right? But there's also the possibility that we may be looking at the need, whatever might be, to begin to have defensive features because there are resources within this space that you might need to protect. So as granaries begin to be developed because agricultural surplus, right? That might just be some of the reasons why you might need infrastructural features of this nature. Just one last thing here, at least in terms of the macro space. And if you think about it, we're kind of like almost like a Google Map experience where we're all the way down at the micro level, and then we're going up, right, to the village, and then we're going higher. And if you look at this large geographical space, you will realize that even at this high macro level, or stratospheric level, a couple of things are happening around about 5,000 and 4,000 BC in Neolithic China. So firstly, places of religion are absolutely important, right? And they are fairly few and far between, right? So that's where the focus of your religious practices will occur. There's one here, there's another temple here. The other thing to note is, if you look at the topography, the dark spots like these, for example, are the highest points in this place. So this is obviously a hill area, right? 1,000 meters high, about 3,000 feet in elevation up here. And then this is also a little high, but not as high. This part will be what? A valley, right? So this is a valley, right? But these spaces, or at least these points, are somewhat located where? On the highest points in the valley, right? So this is where you would grow your food, because this valley, all the water goes down. Remember our geography lesson from last week? Yeah. And then all your different villages and settlements are all located here and all over these places and all that. But the important ritual sites, including, for example, a pyramid building here, and the temple that is dedicated to the goddess, which is here, are located at the higher points, right, of this entire settlement landscape, all right? So it's quite interesting that we see spatial hierarchies developing as well, prizing certain kinds of activities, and then certain other kinds of activities like normal life, village life is kind of pretty ordinary, but religion seems to be, and worship seems to be activities that are given sort of top priority, and in terms of space, allocated spaces that are preferential, right, and interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Damien.
So there's only one place of worship?
At this, in this map, yeah, it does look like there is only one place of worship, which is this, right, the goddess temple, okay? There is a possibility that this may be it, although a pyramid building in and of itself, without any other accompanying material cultural remains that suggest ritual or spiritual worship or spiritual activities, could possibly also be a civic center, a focal point, like where all the different heads of the villages might come together and gather and meet in this one location here, right? So it could be a civic center without the accompanying material culture that indicates that the activities there are ritual based, right? In this map, the archaeological data really only just points to this particular location here, okay, as the place where we would be looking at ritual and spiritual activities. being conducted. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, it looks like that's the one. Doesn't prevent anybody else from having their own personal kind of like ritual activities in their own village or homes and so on and so forth. But in terms of this large geographical space, that would be the focal point for religious and ritual activities. Any other questions, anybody? That's a good one, Damien. So thanks a lot for that question. No? Okay, good. So in terms of spiritual aspects, then therefore, right, we're beginning to see some of that in the Neolithic period from about 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 BC. And there are some major differences between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic period. So Paleolithic man, typically, if we do manage to find graves, they are very, very shallow. And they don't really have what we call locational logic to define. So it's like there's a cave, somewhere in the back of the cave, right? There just happen to be some bones, okay? For Neolithic sites, especially in places like China, Japan, Korea, spiritual sites or sites that are associated to ritual and even related, not necessarily to death, but to the unseen, okay, as opposed to the seen. So like you and I are beings that are that can be seen, right? We are seen beings, okay? In certain cultures, there are beings that are unseen, okay? So they do exist, we just don't see them, okay? But they're around, okay? And at least for China and Northeast Asia, when it comes to Neolithic religion and spirituality, firstly, there are special locations. So the goddess temple, for example, here is a good example of what that means, like special location. There is a certain hierarchy in the spatial distribution and logic that we are seeing. The other thing that's very important as well is the longevity of these sites. So some of these sites of worship or of spiritual activity in the Neolithic period can last for like 1,000 or more years. So people over many successive generations, right, are constantly going back to that same one location, right, to conduct these same set of activities. And so what that creates is a reinforcing effect that then makes such locations and the activities all the more important, and they have a heightened importance, right, in the society that they're part of. And for Neolithic society, there is a very strong association between burial and beliefs. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So somebody mentioned, like, was asking the question earlier on when we were looking at this map, like, why is the cemetery located so close to habitation sites, for example, clusters of homes? And the answer is that it does look like, and because nobody knows for sure, because there are no textual documents to confirm that, okay? That there is a very close correlation between those that are alive, and so beings that are seen, and beings that are unseen, right? So just because you're dead does not necessarily mean that you're no more here, okay? It just means that you have gone from a physical manifestation being into what we call you transcend, okay, the transcendence process, which is death, into what is known as unseen being. Now, like I said, there is no textual data, obviously, to corroborate this idea and confirm or affirm it. But by the time you have textual material in China, which is roughly about 2,300, 2,200 BC, those textual materials do talk about ritual, the place of death, the place of spirits, and so on and so forth. And they do mention that the way that the society that looks at the dead, the spirits, and the humans in physical form is such that they are all on a same plane, right? So there's no such thing as a heaven, there's no such thing as a hell. You all exist in what is effectively the same plane, okay, the same plane of existence. So by 2,300, 2,200 BC, that idea of the spiritual world and how we perceive the spiritual world, at least in North China, has already been established. So it's not necessarily too far-fetched to postulate, as you look back from there to about 4,000 or 5,000 BC, that is how in the Neolithic societies in North China, at least, right, looked at spirits, looked at the people who have died, and then those who are alive, and the relationship between all of these. Okay, so does that make sense? Any questions, anybody? Because I realize that that's quite a mouthful, and conceptually it's actually quite a bit. Do I need to clarify anything at all? Give me a thumbs up if you think it's okay. Okay, thank you. And again, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand or just interrupt me if you need to. Okay, totally okay. So it's not just these sorts of rudimentary, like sort of spatial relationships, right, between the living cluster and the cluster that is like deceased. Okay, when we think about like burials in the Neolithic period, so this is a 5,300 BC burial in north central China. What is really interesting is that it portrays a couple of things. Okay, so these are shell middens, and the shells were used to create an image that is, according at least to the art historians and archaeologists, this is a white tiger, and this is supposed to be something like a dragon. It's a dragon, but kind of has characteristics of a worm, okay, or a snake. So changlong, which just means, you know, a slithering dragon, right? So you get ideas of animals, zoomorphic, right? Zoomorphic creatures that are specific to the spirit realm, right? The spirit realm, okay? But the other thing that's really interesting is this, okay? So this is the actual person who has died. This is the actual person who, I mean, they're all dead, obviously, because they're skeletons here, okay? But the tomb was intended for this person who was, according to the archaeological report, supposed to be a ruler of this Neolithic culture cluster, right, that was located in this geographical region. What is interesting is that then you also have these three dead bodies here, okay? Notice the size is different. So this is a full-grown size male, all right? Does anybody know who these two are? I mean, at least in terms of, so this is a male adult, right? Okay. Does anybody know who these two might be? Yeah, Damien, go ahead if you are able to answer, or somebody else can jump in. Anyone?
Servants or children?
Mm-hmm. So just biologically, they look like they're actually children because they're smaller. Yeah. Yeah. And then what about this one? Sorry?
The left one's missing a pelvis, right?
Yeah. So somebody had a pelvis missing, which may or may not suggest, they still don't know whether that was taken like, you know, sort of violently, right? Whether somebody got decapitated in half at the middle part, or it was just, you know, the weight pressure of the burial site, the whatever earth was covering, you know, above the burial site kind of collapsed down and crushed the bones. But yeah, good observation. The pelvis is missing. What else? What about this one? Somebody?
Could it be like a, if we're doing family members, like either the mother or even the great ancestors?
Mm-hmm. So if you can read Chinese, there are terms here that the original archaeological report had written, which means, so this one, Taizi just means basically the prince, okay? And then Gongzu means princess. And then so in the original archaeological report, this burial looked like it was a familial burial. So whoever it was, this person who died, and then they basically just put these family members in there, obviously killed them and then interned them, right, as animals, as human sacrifices to accompany this burial. This is from a very, very early report when it first appeared in 1988. More recently, the Chinese archaeologists have actually revised this conclusion and are more inclined to think that these were actually just servants and that this was a male steward that was interned. So in other words, they're not related, And I think maybe that the reason why they've come to this new conclusion is that they've done the DNA test on the bones or the remains that's allowed them to sort of map the DNA relationship between this the 4 people in this burial site, and apparently they're not related at all. But what it does suggest is that here is one of the earliest examples in Northeast Asia, in East Asia in particular, but definitely in China, where somebody who is deceased is interned, right, with other people who were not necessarily dead at the time when they were buried in this tomb. And that suggests a couple of things, right? So one, it suggests what? Does anybody have any sense of what that would suggest? If you intern a dead person and then you would have a couple of other dead people in there, what does that suggest?
If it was like willingly or not.
So they may have, I don't know about you, but most people would not be willing to die like that, right? So it looks like the ability to coerce and to actually have command over somebody's life was beginning to happen very early on in Neolithic society in China, right? So you could actually control and command the actual life of a person, not just their muscle, not just their time, not just their effort, right? Not even their money. You could actually maintain control over their life, right? So that to me is a tremendously significant social development, okay, in Northeast Asia, but specifically here, China. Yeah, Nicholas.
But doesn't that also depend on belief system? Because I know, like in Norse mythology and some of the cultures, servants would willingly go with them as an honor.
There is that possibility. So religion then therefore comes in here as part, even from a coercive point of view. Some of the best ways that you could do that would be to be able to actually have a religious articulation, right, of the spirit world and all these sorts of things that you would actually see that. Yeah, Kayla, you're not wrong in suggesting that there's the possibility that we are looking at slaves. But again, it reinforces that idea, right, that you actually own somebody, okay? You don't just like buy their time, you actually own them, okay? We can do cross-cultural comparisons to other civilizational cultures. So if you think of Mesopotamia, for example, in Mesopotamia, this doesn't really happen. You do not really find graves in Mesopotamia where you see, right, people interned with somebody who is obviously the dead person, right, for which this particular grave was built for, okay? And that's an interesting difference between like Northeast Asia and in this case, China by about 5000 BC and that. Obviously, there are other places where you do see this. So Egypt is a very good example of that, where you do see human sacrifices, not necessarily within the tomb itself, but outside and around the pyramids. You do see that. Yeah, go ahead, Damien.
I was wondering, is there relevance to why the bottom skeleton isn't straight like the other 3?
So this is where everybody goes on a field day. If you are an archaeologist, you know, everything has a spiritual implication, and so they're trying to figure out whether there's something to do with a geometry that is religious in nature or spiritual in nature. The real answer is nobody really knows. It could possibly just have been that the body was just placed like kind of wrongly in a slightly off position. There does not seem to be any reason why the body is in this particular position. So, but as you can tell from all these triangles that are being drawn by by the archaeologists, they're like, you know, like, wow, you know, we're trying to come up with something to explain every possible little detail that's there, right? Let's see. Kayla, what was your comment? I see a little chat box, but I couldn't really sort of capture the whole comment that you had. Yeah, right. So animal depictions, are you referring to this one here? Yeah, it's a possibility. So maybe, although I have an image of this particular site, you'll notice that the bulk of the materials that that they found in the tomb is, apart from the human bodies, they really are just these shell middens. Okay, and this is a very far off location from the nearest maritime coastline, right? It's roughly about 6 to 800 miles away. Okay, it's far in, and so obviously these items were extremely expensive to sort of bring in, and then to have it buried or interned in this tomb meant that whoever was able to afford it was somebody who was extremely wealthy. Okay, this is another example of another tomb. So about 1,000 years later, fast forward from the one that we just saw, which is dated roughly the middle of the 6th millennium BC. By the time you get to about 4,000 BC, 3,000 BC, one of the things that's really interesting is that this is it's a large pit. They put the body in there, the materials in there, and they covered the whole thing up. It probably had a mound. If you look at it in terms of a cross section, there probably was a mound. And then, you know, if you were standing next to it, this is where you would be. By the time you get to this, what is apparent is that you would have a very big pit, right? So the pit, the burial pit is much larger than this image here. Okay, it's much larger than this image here. But then right in the middle, you would have this space, which is lined by slabs of stone, and then you actually have a casket as well, right? This thing here, in which you would place the body, right? And then all these different levels of space, from the much larger outside to the smaller, and then all the way down into the casket, you actually have a range of grave goods that you would place. So this was obviously somebody who was extremely well-to-do, right? These are the kind of items that, these are the items that were recovered from this particular grave, right? Maybe not as high in terms of social status as this individual, all right? So we don't really find, human sacrifices here, but materially, very, very opulent and extremely rich. Okay, ceramics. You have jade items or stone items like this, for example, stone ornaments such as these, and then you have all these different types of ceramic items that were interred in there. It was a fairly rich grave. As we move through on in time to just at the cusp of the historic period, so roughly about 2250 BC, we find that such burial practices in Neolithic cultures in China and definitely in Northeast Asia, including places like Japan and Korea, right, developed to an extremely elaborate and sort of, rich manner, and this is a very good example of a South Chinese burial. So this area is close to modern-day Shanghai, near the Yangtze River Delta area. Sort of, if you think of the Chinese coastline, it's kind of in the middle of it. And this is a burial site of somebody that was interred. Just have a quick look at all these pieces. And I'll show you one in detail. So here's one, which is a piece of jade, fairly large, roughly about 15 centimeters, about half a foot long, about this size. Quite flat. If you look at it in terms of its other profile, it's relatively flat, about this big. It's a circle, which is pretty phenomenal if you think of how difficult it is to actually draw a perfect circle, and they do too. They actually cut the piece of jade, which is a very, very tough piece of stone geologically, so that they will slice it. It's thin. They'll cut the circle, the large outer profile, and then they will drill a hole in here, all of which will require a significant amount of time. And then that's one of many pieces, right, that are located in this particular tomb, for example. Okay, so this is an item that not only is very tedious and time-consuming to produce, it is also extremely expensive, because this kind of jade is only found in Central Asia. So that suggests that some kind of trade exchange had to occur all the way from Central Asia through a relay system all the way to the East Coast, right, the Southeast coast of China, right? And that's a substantial distance of several thousand miles. And somehow that material made it from Central Asia through the rest of China and shows up on the east coast of China, where they would produce it. And the sole purpose of making this item, which costs a lot of money and a lot of time, is to just put it into that grave. Okay, here's another example of the items that were discovered in that particular tomb. And it's not the only one, there were quite a lot of them. And so these are the items. Again, another piece of jade. Somebody had to take a lot of time to sort of carve out this image here and then drill a hole all the way through. And this would then be utilized, as a burial offering for obviously somebody who was very well to do. One of the interesting things that we see in the late Neolithic culture of East Asia, and in this case China, is that we start to begin to see imagery, right? Spiritual imagery begin to appear. So does anybody know what animal this is depicting, these things here? Anyone? Wild guess. It looks like something, but it's not quite that thing. But what do you think that looks like? Anyone?
Owls.
Owls? Yeah, that's a possibility. What else, Damien?
Eagles or a dragon?
That could be a possibility, but you can't quite define it, right? You can't kind of categorically, say that's what it is, right? It's kind of there, but it's not quite there. What about this image? I mean, we've got things, for example, like this. What do you think that animal is?
A dragon.
Yeah, it could be. Although it kind of, again, right? It's not quite there. Yeah. What about this one? Anyone?
Monkey.
Sorry.
A gorilla.
Gorilla. Who said gorilla?
Me.
Okay, so that's a possibility that we might be looking at like a symbiont animal. But again, bearing in mind that gorillas actually do not exist in that part of the world, throughout, right? So that's an interesting idea and a possibility, although we just can't be sure, right, what it is, right? What about this one? Okay, this one, no guesses. Anybody? It's a dog. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What about this?
Some kind of owl or bird.
Sloth.
Who knows, right? It could be like a feral animal or something like that. The possibility of that. I mean, the list goes on. But what is interesting about these zoomorphic depictions is, like, unlike in many other instances where right, a cow is a cow, a dog is a dog, right? Or even a dragon is a dragon. Here, one of the interesting features of zoomorphic depictions of the spiritual world and spiritual beings in late Neolithic China is that they look like animals that we kind of can recognize, but we can't be very certain that that's what they are, okay? And scholars have argued that that is actually a way that Neolithic Chinese societies were utilizing, right, artistically, to articulate the difference between those beings or animals that are in the natural world, so a dog is a dog and you will recognize it when you see it, right? And a dog-like animal, spirit animal in the spirit world, right? Which is like kind of like a dog, but you're not really entirely sure that it is a dog. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay, so this thing about how do you begin to depict, right, the spiritual world and its beings and what it represents and means to you who is alive and your society that's alive becomes part of the discourse that late Neolithic society in East Asia, and in this case in China, are beginning to sort of try to come to terms with, okay? Let me just run through this one last slide and I'll take a few questions if you have. What is interesting, obviously, is, let me see, I don't have the full image of this particular jade. But if you were to step far away from the image, what you might see is the head of an animal, or the top head of an animal, the eyes, right, the nose or the nostril portion of an animal or zoomorphic depiction, and then you have the mouth, right? But then if you go close to it, obviously this is a head of a man with a beautiful, right, either headgear or hairdo, holding two round jade pieces, yeah, sitting cross-legged on a what? On a dais, okay? And so two things that you could think about. One, artistically or at least aesthetically, late Neolithic culture in China was actually pretty advanced in that they were trying to do interesting things to sort of depict spiritual beings, and so you get that zoomorphic image here. But at the same time, they were also trying to portray that there are humans that have this very close association, right, between a spirit being and themselves as humans. So you have basically that interchangeability between like an animal in the spiritual world and the human being who is like the interlocutor or the interface, right? So these are the ones who are very important in late Neolithic Chinese and East Asian society by the time we get to about 2000 BC, right? They are the ones who seem to be the conduits between the spiritual and the natural world. And because of that, they then hold an extremely high status as a result of that, okay? And here's a hint, all right? In early historic Chinese society, around about 2200 to 2000 BC, and we'll look at them next week, the rulers of the early dynasty in historic China were very often people who actually played a shaman role as well, okay? So that gives you a sense of how, you know, Neolithic or prehistoric society in China articulated, right, rulership over time, right, and social differences and social stratification, okay? So just as the last bit, aesthetics, thinking about the materials that I use, like jade, for example, but also the value that is placed on decorative arts. Because you need people who are trained, who have time. They don't have to go into the farm, you know, in order to plant food or raise the animals. And their sole purpose is primarily to just produce lovely things so that those who are the social elite and the economic elite can appreciate, enjoy, consume them, and utilize them. And you begin to see that sort of economic differentiation and stratification occur as well. All right, I'll leave this last slide because we're slowly running out of time. And maybe I'll spend a minute or two taking any questions. Anyone?
This is more of just like, it's somewhat off topic, but would the giving of the grave goods, like putting in the graves like that, would that kind of be a good like comparison with like modern day China, where you would burn the like the money and the luxury goods? Is that kind of like correlated with each other, or is that just a separate tradition?
So one of the things that a lot of archaeologists and historians will argue is that there's a substantial continuity between even practices today and all the way to the Neolithic period, and sometimes even to the Paleolithic period. So the argument is that there is a substantial sort of, you know, continuity in that. So if you see some of those echoes, you are not necessarily wrong. There are a lot of practices in terms of religion that has continued all the way through to even up to now.
Is it possible that there are depictions of multiple animals rather than a single animal?
Yeah, there is that possibility. And again, I think you will see that in some of the material culture and the artistic depictions. Sometimes, though, it's like one animal with two very clear kinds of species features. Okay, so that's another set of interesting things that we see in terms of the artistic depiction.
Is it possible for the tomb that the three extra bodies could be like their royal guard, so to speak, if it was a high-ranking individual?
Yep,
so
there is that possibility. The fact that there are children that were interned in that grave suggests that that may not be the only reason, or rather the only occupation of those internees. That there's the possibility that we are looking at, you know, little pages or you know, maids in waiting. And as we get into the early historic period, some of the graves actually have like lots of dead people in them, right? Apart from the main person who's interned. And so that's, it looks like it's a continuation of that practice from about 4000 BC, 5000 BC into 2000 BC.